Why control always arrives during chaos. It never begins as control. It begins as necessity. A moment when uncertainty feels unbearable, when speed matters more than debate, and when hesitation carries visible cost. In those moments, control does not feel threatening. It feels responsible. To understand why this pattern keeps repeating, we have to look at how chaos changes decision-making. When systems strain, complexity becomes dangerous. Multiple voices slow action. Distributed responsibility blurs accountability. And in the fog of uncertainty, the demand for coordination grows louder. The cognitive and emotional conditions that chaos creates are precisely the conditions under which centralized authority appears most attractive. Chaos produces fear, and fear produces a willingness to surrender autonomy in exchange for order. History shows the same sequence again and again. Volatility spikes, confidence wavers, information fragments, and almost immediately, authority consolidates. Not because freedom is rejected, but because order is urgently required. Control promises clarity when everything else feels unstable. The promise is not empty. Centralized authority genuinely can act faster, communicate more clearly, and coordinate more effectively than distributed systems under acute stress. At first, this consolidation appears temporary. Emergency structures are created. Centralized decisions replace decentralized ones. Power gathers at the point where action can be taken fastest. The system breathes again. Panic recedes. Chaos retreats. The reveal begins here. Each time control restores calm, it reinforces a powerful lesson. Centralization works under pressure. Coordination prevents collapse. And once that lesson is learned, it is rarely forgotten. The lesson embeds itself not just in institutional memory, but in the behavioral patterns of every participant. The experience of being saved by centralized action creates a lasting expectation that centralized action is the appropriate response to uncertainty. Participants adapt quickly. Markets learn to wait for guidance. Institutions align behavior around expected direction. Responsibility shifts upward. Stability begins to depend less on interaction and more on instruction. This is the early tension forming. Control arrives to manage chaos, but also reshapes how the system functions afterward. What was once collaborative becomes directive. What was once adaptive becomes responsive. The transformation is not imposed. It is adopted. Because the system's experience of being rescued by control create a rational preference for continued control. The system does not resist this change. It welcomes it, because in moments of chaos, control feels like safety. And safety, once experienced, is difficult to relinquish. As control settles in, its presence begins to feel less like intervention and more like structure. What was introduced to manage crisis starts shaping everyday behavior. Decisions align around centralized signals. Deviation feels risky. Coordination gives way to compliance. Institutions adjust first. Rather than interpreting conditions independently, they look for direction. Policy guidance becomes a reference point. Markets stop asking what fundamentals imply and start asking what authority might tolerate. Control, once reactive, becomes anticipatory. The shift from reactive to anticipatory control is significant because it means that authority is no longer responding to events, but preempting them, shaping outcomes before they occur rather than managing them after they arrive. This shift alters incentives quietly. Acting without guidance feels exposed. Waiting feels prudent. Responsibility migrates upward, not through force, but through habit. When outcomes are shaped by centralized action, autonomy loses its reward. The reveal deepens here. Control simplifies complexity, but it also filters information. Signals that once emerged from many independent decisions now pass through fewer channels. Noise is reduced, but so is diversity of response. The system becomes easier to steer, yet less sensitive to subtle change. The reduction in informational diversity is one of the most consequential side effects of centralization. A system that processes information through many independent nodes detects anomalies faster than one that processes information through a single channel, regardless of how capable that channel may be. Markets reflect this transformation. Volatility dampens. Corrections become smoother, but price discovery weakens. Movements feel managed rather than emergent. Stability appears stronger, but it is increasingly dependent on continued direction. The early conflict sharpens. Control prevents chaos, but also delays adaptation. When authority absorbs uncertainty, participants lose the incentive to adjust early. Small imbalances persist. Pressure accumulates beneath calm surfaces. Those inside the system begin to sense the constraint. Everything works, but only as long as guidance continues. The question of what happens without it grows harder to ignore. Control has solved the immediate problem. Now it is quietly creating the next one. The tension reaches emotional peak when the system faced uncertainty without clear direction. Not a crisis severe enough to justify full intervention, but not calm enough to ignore. This in-between state exposed how deeply behavior had been shaped by control. Institutions hesitated. Markets stalled. Participants waited for signals that did not arrive. The system had grown accustomed to guidance during stress, and without it, confidence wavered. Not because conditions were dire, but because autonomy had atrophied. This was the heart of the conflict. Control had preserved order, but it had also reduced initiative. Participants were no longer practiced at responding independently. Decision-making had been centralized long enough that decentralized response felt risky. The emotional weight of this moment came from realization. The system was stable but dependent, strong but hesitant. Control had solved chaos by narrowing choices, and now those narrowed choices limited response. Internally, concern grew. Could the system still function without direction? Or had it become reliant on authority to interpret uncertainty on its behalf? The question was unsettling because it challenged the very mechanism that had restored calm in the first place. Markets reflected this unease. Movements were tentative. Liquidity thinned. Confidence flickered, not from fear of collapse, but from uncertainty about leadership. Control had become the reference point for action. The buildup was complete. The system stood at a crossroads. Continue expanding control to maintain confidence, or step back and risk disorder while autonomy rebuilt. Neither path was comfortable, and the choice would shape how the system evolved next. The resolution came through restraint rather than expansion. Control was not abandoned, but it was intentionally loosened. Authority stepped back just enough to allow uncertainty to surface, and to let the system relearn how to respond to it. The climax revealed a difficult balance. Too little control invites chaos. Too much control invites dependence. Stability does not come from choosing one forever, but from knowing when to shift between them. The system had leaned on authority long enough. Now it had to rebuild confidence from within. As guidance softened, participants adjusted cautiously. Decisions were made without immediate confirmation. Prices moved more freely. Volatility returned in measured waves. It was uncomfortable, but it was informative. The system began processing stress again, rather than waiting for it to be removed. The resolution reshaped understanding. Control is most effective when it is temporary. Its purpose is to restore function, not replace it. When authority withdraws deliberately, it gives space for adaptation to return. And adaptation, not instruction, is what sustains systems over time. What endured was a clear lesson. Control always arrives during chaos, but it must also know when to leave. Otherwise, it changes the system it protects into something less capable of standing on its own. True resilience is not built by constant direction. It is built by learning when to let go. Sometimes the smallest shift in perspective becomes the beginning of a new future. Why